We had to postpone the meeting in January where we were going to have Ruth come to talk to us at Parlour to Poorhouse because of the bad weather, but we have rescheduled it to the 23rd of March, so we will be redoing that talk. Our next meeting is going to be the 13th of March when we've got Denise Hodgkinson coming to talk about St Asaph's history. I do have to tell you, I don't know if everybody knows, but I must also mention the sad death of Molly Evans. She died the 21st of January. She was 94. She was in a nursing home in Bristol. So the funeral was on the 4th of March, but Wenna has sent a card and condolences on behalf of the group. But I think that's all for now. We just have to go and enjoy our talk, and then we'll have some tea and chat afterwards, and I'll catch up with any of you if there's anything else you need to tell me that I've forgotten to tell you. Okay, so please, Dick, make us up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. When had asked me months and months ago to do it, but I'd forgotten all about it. Until I saw Trevor in Sainsbury's about a fortnight ago, and he said, "You're coming to talk to us in a fortnight, aren't you?" I need to make one apology.
Good job you reminded him.
I'm a little bit disappointed and a little angry as well, because about 2 weeks ago when I started getting stuff together, I went to Greenfield to the Knitmesh factory, and I asked them if I could borrow the archive file that I had left there when I retired 14 years ago with my successor. Unfortunately, they've been unable to find it. And in that file were old brochures and old photographs of Knitmesh in Rhuddlan. So I've had to make do amend, so apologies beforehand for some of the stuff. The quality of some of the stuff is not that good, but I'll do my best.
Do you want the lights down?
If you like it, it doesn't matter. It depends whether you can see it or not. It makes no difference to me, really. I always find it a little strange, you know, that when people talk about the old factory across the bridge, they always call it Knitmesh. And then they follow that up by saying, they used to make scourers there, didn't they? And in saying that, they're only getting it partly right in a sense. And when I point out to them that it wasn't Knitmesh that made them, it immediately leads to the next question. So what do Knitmesh do? What did they do? Now that's a question really to answer in detail would take hours and hours, so I normally sort of cobble up some sort of answer in 2 minutes, which exasperates people and puzzles them. But they always end up by saying, so how did a company that does stuff like that end up in Rhuddlan of all places? So lest you ask the same questions, I want you to stick with me for the next hour or so that I can put matters straight, as it were. Most people, and I'm quite sure all of you are amongst this group, have no conception of how knitted wire is knit. So I'm going to play a short video clip to start with. It doesn't last long, it's less than a minute and a half, and I borrowed it from Greenfield. So at least you've got some idea of how it's done. Sorry, something's gone wrong. Come on. Go. There it goes.
It's like French written.
So there you have it. That's how a basic knitting machine works. Although there are lots of variations in wire thickness, stitch shape and size, etc. that can be produced on machines that range from, I suppose, 6mm, that's 1/4 of an inch in old money, to about 1 metre wide on very large machines. The technique of knitting metals was developed by the French in the 1800s. And it was a small group of French people who decided to set up a company with a small factory at 4 Rockingham Street in the Elephant and Castle area of London in 1936 to manufacture pot scourers from knitted copper and galvanised steel meshes. The company was a subsidiary of a French company, Société de Façonnage et de Commerce, a company with an office in Paris and a manufacturing plant at Velaine in eastern France, where they made, amongst other things, musical instruments, brass and woodwind. These were sold in the UK through the well-known London company Boosey and Hawkes. And among the staff there was a Frenchman, a Monsieur Jacques Quenon. Now, this gentleman lived with his wife and 2 sons in Hendon, North London. And he happened to be a friend of another Frenchman, a Monsieur Motu, who was a shareholder in Société Façonnage et de Commerce, and who therefore had an interest in this little company in the Elephant and Castle, which the French, showing to my mind certainly a deplorable lack of imagination, had named Household Articles Limited. And by late 1939, during the Phoney War, this little company was in financial trouble. And Monsieur Motu asked his friend Jacques Quenon if he'd help to reorganise it. Now Francis Quenon, Jacques Quenon's youngest son, then aged 14, went to assist his father to take stock at Rockingham Street. The factory sounds a bit Dickensian from his description. It was on the 2nd floor of an old building next to a railway line, with a jam factory on the ground floor. Francis recalled his father commenting that he'd never seen fruit of any kind going in through the front door into this jam factory, but I suppose as it was wartime, perhaps they were using Swedes or parsnips or something like that. The knitting shop operated rather antiquated and clapped out machines, primarily of French origin, and it was run by a Cockney, a man called Percy Gladys. And at the time, the company was producing pot scourers and also making some wire wool. Now the scourers are not made in-house. Mesh was cut to length and put in Hessian sacks, which were then distributed to outworkers who made them into scourers, for which they were paid piecework by the gross. Remember, we always had these old silly ideas in those days, didn't we? Feet and inches and gross, 144 scourers. They were unpacked at the factory and dispatched. By 1940, the company was struggling to survive, but they'd begun to manufacture small quantities of galvanised steel meshes, which were used to make simple air filters for tanks and lorries and tractors, etc. And Quenon Sr. often expressed the view to his son that it would be through finding industrial and technical uses for knitted meshes that the company would survive. And he was eventually to be proved correct. With the invasion of France, all contact with the French owners ceased for the duration of the war. And later that year, after the fall of France, the shares of Household Articles, which was a British registered company, were transferred to British trustees, as the French were now officially enemy aliens and not allowed to hold shares in British companies. The trustees in question were hang on, I got lost somewhere. The trustees in question were 2 partners in a North London accountancy practice, P.B. Bishop and Company, who were the company's auditors and accountants. Peter Bishop and Reginald Edwards, the partners in this company, were to remain directors until their deaths in the 70s and 80s. On the death of Reg Edwards, P.B. Bishop was incorporated into what is now one of the UK's leading accountancy practices, Wilkins Kennedy and Company. And in fact, there was a relationship between the companies right up until the 1990s. In the autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain had drawn to a close with the Luftwaffe failing to defeat the RAF. And the Germans, of course, as we all know, then changed tack and started a campaign of night bombing on the major cities in the UK. The Quenon family home narrowly missed being destroyed by a bomb which landed in the street nearby. Fortunately, the house wasn't severely damaged, but Quennon Sr. had enough of a fright to immediately arrange for his wife and younger son to be sent out of London as evacuees. And they ended up at Tywyn, Abergele, of all places. Quennon Sr. remained in London to look after the business. One can well imagine that business was particularly difficult at this time, and to those difficulties was added the fear that the factory could of course be destroyed. The father therefore asked his son, who was only 14 and a half, if he could find premises in North Wales which could accommodate some of the more important machines. And in early 1941 he found the old Magneto Works, as they were then called, next to the laundry in Rhuddlan, across the bridge. The company immediately took out a 21-year lease on the two front bays of that building with an option for a further 21 years. By March-April 1941, they'd managed to move 6 knitting machines from London to Rhuddlan. And Francis Quennon was employed at the tender age of 15 to run them. The Rhuddlan factory had only been opened for 2 days when on the 11th of May 1941 the Luftwaffe got to the Rockingham Street factory. The whole building was burnt to the ground and all its contents destroyed, including presumably the jam on the ground floor. Thanks to the foresight of Mr. Jacques Quennon, all the company's papers were saved because he'd taken to carry them with him everywhere in his briefcase. With no factory left to manage in London, he too moved up to North Wales, and also 1 or 2 of the employees at Rockingham Street came with him. The knitting shop foreman Percy Gladys, in fact, was to stay at Rhuddlan until 1955. By mid-1941, household articles were settled in at their new premises, which had been renamed the Phoenix Works, the company having literally risen from the flames of Rockingham Street. Francis Quennon later recalled that at home in the evenings he joined his mother in making scourers as outworkers. They were paid 1 and 6pence per gross for making scourers. After only a short stay, Quennon Sr. returned to London, as nearly all the wholesale customers, and all the retail customers in fact, were based in the southeast, and he rented an office at the premises of the accountants who were then based in Edgware. Later on during the war, when things had quietened down, the Quennon family all returned to London, leaving Percy Gladys to run production at Rhuddlan, where they now had a staff of 15 people. The company's fortunes improved slightly as they produced more meshes for filters and some small amounts for other military applications, such as collapsible radar reflectors. I remember seeing one of these things. It was a little folding device, quite clever, like a tiny little umbrella, with some Monel mesh all over it. And it was stored in rubber dinghies so that airmen could possibly be found if they were shot down over the North Sea on the way back from the continent. And no doubt it probably helped to save quite a few people's lives. The bulk of the factory's output for the rest of the war was still pot scourers. Francis Quennon returned to Rhuddlan from London in 1947. He then completed his 2 years national service in the French Air Force. Of course, he'd been born in France, and he remained, in fact, a French citizen throughout his life, although he didn't live in France afterwards until he retired from work in South England, in the southeast, in 1986, when he went to live in Normandy. After coming to Rhuddlan, he spent about 6 months on a basic general engineering course at a company in Hull called Kingston Engineering. This company had built the company's new knitting machines to old French drawings in 1941-42 to replace the ones that they lost, and they were paid for with grants that they got from the government because they were making some of these meshes for war work. Mr. Quennon Sr. and his wife had meanwhile gone back to France. With the new machinery and a reasonable order book, the company managed to keep the wolf from the door, but increasing competition from some emerging European countries, including Germany, who of course won the peace, we won the war, they made life difficult for them. A major problem was the lack of any technical ability amongst the staff, which often resulted in the loss of contracts due to an unacceptably high level of rejection. The Korean War of 1952 provided a boost, but at the end of that war, the company was almost destroyed when cancellation of contracts at short notice left them with far too much stock and virtually no money. The banks, as they always do, refuse to help. It's odd, isn't it? If you've thought about this thing, banks are always happy to lend money to people who've already got it and therefore don't need it, but they don't lend money to people who don't have any and therefore want it. It's an odd thing, but they refuse to help anyway. And the company was forced to go back to the French shareholders for some more cash, and it was only through sheer hard work and stringent financial management that the company avoided bankruptcy. In mid-1955, Percy Gladys left to set up his own knitting shop in Rhuddlan. Unfortunately, he took some of the customers with him as well. The production side in Rhuddlan was now being run by a local couple, Hedley and Jane Walding. Hedley Walding was a South Walian. I think he'd probably come up here through Kimble Camp because he was in the army during the war. Jane Walding was, I believe, from Rhuddlan. I think, not sure, but I think she was a member of the Fagan family in Rhuddlan. Her sister Margaret worked at the factory as well at the same time, and they were there when I came. Francis Quenon returned to London in 1955, where he took on the role of general manager, responsible for sales and accounts and the general running of the business. With him in 3 very small offices in 36 Victoria Street were a secretary and a lady bookkeeper. Here he's demonstrating some French kitchenware at an exhibition in Earl's Court, probably in the late 1950s. By this time there were a small number of companies emerging in Europe, and more particularly in the United States, who were working on technical applications of knitted meshes. And household articles were quite regularly being approached by British companies who were looking for a suitable manufacturer, both to develop and manufacture specifically for the growing chemical engineering and electronic industries, amongst others. But opportunities were being lost due to the fact that there were still no suitably qualified personnel within the company. What industrial business they were able to attract was being eroded by the poor quality and lack of consistency in the production of the few orders they got, and the directors at Edgware decided, and unless this problem was urgently addressed, the company would soon go to the wall. They were in quite a poor state. It was felt that due to the more complex nature, particularly of some of the finer meshes and thinner filaments that they were being asked to produce, that the company should seek to employ a new knitting shop manager who had the requisite skills and experience. They duly advertised locally, and this led to the employment in late 1955 of a guy called Bill Colley. At the time, he and his wife Rita were living in Towyn, and Bill had been working at Chance Pilkington's in St Asaph when he saw the advertisement. He'd moved to North Wales from Bolton, where he'd worked on knitting machinery in the cotton industry. He was also a trained and a skilled mechanic because he'd served in the Royal Air Force during the war as an engine fitter, and he could therefore repair and maintain machines as well as bring to the company the experience gained on what were quite complex textile machines. With the coming of Bill Colley, Hedley Walding moved to take charge of the stores, and he also delivered material to outworkers. There were still 1 or 2 women in the village who were making scourers, but the bulk of the outwork at that time was being done at the local mental hospitals, North Wales Hospital in Denbigh and Diva Hospital in Chester, where work of this nature was carried out as part of occupational therapy. The quality of the work, as you can well understand, wasn't good, and the scourers had to be checked carefully before they were packed and dispatched. You'll notice that I'm now included in this picture a bright red scourer in the picture because plastics were now more readily available and cheap. The early plastic ones are made of nylon, but this was replaced eventually by polypropylene because it withstood boiling water. Nylon didn't, they just shrank. The company, however, still needed someone to instigate and lead technical advance. And in 1956, David Price Bailey joined the company. A Cheshire man, he'd begun training as an architect in Chester in the late 1930s, but had been called up for military service on the outbreak of war, and ended up in 1945 as an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in Burma. He worked in a variety of jobs after the war, and by the mid-1950s he was living locally with his wife Nora. He was taken on and he was asked to steer the company into the engineering fields and to try to take advantage of the tiny foothold already gained by the introduction of household articles knitted meshes into the air filtration, motor, chemical engineering and electronic industries. No small task actually, as he had to do this with the barest of resources in terms of know-how, materials, machines and cash. The pot scourer business was contracting, and the sales of meshes and other products for industrial use had been much too small to keep the company afloat. His first task, therefore, was to restore customer confidence by making sure that the few products that were sold were made correctly, and also cutting down on the level of rejects. He had to set up systems of storage and inspection, and revised methods of manufacture in an attempt to ensure that customers came back with repeat orders, or preferably long-term scheduled contracts. In the first 12 months they sold £12,000 worth of orders, and they actually showed just a teeny-weeny profit. At this stage, David pointed out to the board that continued use of the household articles name made it difficult to sell to engineering companies, understandably, and the directors agreed to his suggestion that they should adopt the more descriptive name Knitmesh. In fact, they went one stage further and they set up a new company, Knitmesh Limited, as a wholly owned subsidiary of Household Articles Limited, and it was registered on the 1st of April 1957. This is from a letterheading of this period. Note the little idiosyncrasy of having a capital M in the middle of the name Knitmesh. Interestingly, this has stayed the same to this day. The typeface has changed twice, and the company name has changed recently. It's now Knitmesh Technologies, but the capital M is still there in the middle of the name, and I'm I like that. I like the idea, there's continuity there. So it was now mid-1957, and Knitmesh was a very small firm with no real capital base, and they had only their own resources to call on, as no grant aid existed in those days. The cash situation became so desperate at one point that both Francis Quenon and David Price Bailey had to give personal guarantees to the bank, and they were even forced to draw money from their own bank accounts to provide petty cash for the factory. Nevertheless, as time went by, Knitmesh was slowly expanding and eventually needed more space. They managed to rent... Where are we? Have I gone wrong again? Yes. Sorry about this. They managed to rent a third bay, and they bought ex-army surplus tables and chairs and tea chests from Liverpool tea wholesalers at 6 each, which they stacked on their sides to form a sort of pigeonhole shelving. The big problem, however, of obtaining technical know-how to produce and define their products had to be tackled. Innumerable calculations had to be made to establish the specifications of all the meshes, and then commuting these to suitable and achievable standards. This entailed long hours of work for David and thousands of calculations, but eventually all this hard work enabled the company to produce reliable brochures, which in turn attracted more business. Much of the technical work was done at universities and technical colleges, who were then researching into various aspects of chemical and electronic engineering, and the company was providing materials in return for research results. The first university with which David cooperated was Birmingham, where Professor Steve Ellis of the Chemical Engineering Department was working on the development of knitted mesh packings for distillation columns. Later, in the late 60s, Knitmesh was to begin a long association with the Department of Chemical Engineering at UMIST, the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, where later Professor Graham Davis was to lead cutting-edge and world-leading developments in liquid vapour and liquid separation systems, primarily for the petrochemical and metal extraction industries. By the late 1950s, the Knitmesh workforce had grown to about 12. And Mrs. Joan Green from St Asaph was then providing supervisory and clerical support for Mr. Bailey. Also at this time, Knitmesh were manufacturing mesh pads designed to contain broken blades in the gas turbine engines of the Gloucester Javelin. They were having a problem where the tips of the blades were breaking off and shooting out through the fuselage. Not a happy situation if you're flying up there at a rate of knots. So they made sort of pads which acted as cushions around the engine, which stopped these parts flying out. But the shape of the pads was such that they generated quite a lot of waste offcuts. And they were wondering what to do with them, because it was worth quite a bit of money. And it was at this point that Francis Quennan came up with an idea for a product that was to provide, oddly enough, a steady source of income for household articles in the form of the kettle fur collector. This is a compressed ring which they sold by the millions and were put into kettles to reduce the build-up of lime deposits in kettles. By the early 1960s, Knitmesh had built up a strong customer base, which was a who's who of world-class companies really, during a period of huge industrial expansion right around the globe. Agents had been appointed in France, Belgium, Holland, and the factory at Rhuddlan was busy and profitable at last. However, conflicts of interest were arising between household articles and Knitmesh in-house, because both companies were at times making simultaneous demands on the knitting shop, which Bill Colley was unable to fulfill. He couldn't please everybody all the time. And sometimes it caused a lot of dissent and argument. And at this point, Francis Quennan, who was by this time the managing director of the group, appointed David Price Bailey to be the general manager of the factory. This, of course, only served to increase his workload. He was already dealing with customers, suppliers, acting as a designer and draftsman, setting up and inspecting work on the shop floor, and so on and so forth. And it soon became apparent that he wasn't going to be able to cope. And the decision was made to recruit an assistant for him. And that is when I came in. I came by recommendation in a way. They'd never advertised. I knew David's next door neighbour in Prestatyn. She contacted me and told me that he was looking for someone with a decent education to train as his number two. I travelled up from South Wales to see him. He brought me down to Rhuddlan to see this factory. It came as a bit of a shock actually, because my father was the chief inspector of a pristine watch factory in South Wales. You can imagine the difference between that and this place stinking of oil down the road here, you know. However, it looked promising, and I eventually ended up in London, sitting opposite Francis Quennan being interviewed. In March 1962 they offered me the job at a salary of £350 per annum, plus living out expenses, but they later decided that perhaps I was living too expensively and they consolidated to a fixed salary of £570 a year. Having remained at Aberystwyth University until early summer, I commenced work in Rhuddlan on the 23rd of June 1962, and Rhuddlan, I can assure you, has never been the same since. I spent the first 4 weeks getting to know what and how the departments were doing. But when the factory closed for the fortnight summer holidays, I was sent to London. I worked under the eagle eye of Francis Quennan for 3 months in the office in Victoria Street. Before returning to Rhuddlan, I was also sent around all the household articles agents. Boring, boring. Imagine going round the country talking to people who spent all their days selling pot scours. Can you imagine? It was mind-blowingly dull, I can assure you. These people were as far apart as Bristol and Glasgow. They were all over the place. That was me when I was a bit better looking. After returning to Rhuddlan, I worked primarily in a supervisory role for a while, gradually taking on board all of David Price Bailey's duties on the shop floor, and thus freeing him up to concentrate on his technical sales and development role. In this picture I'm working on a jig that I developed with Bill Colley for the manufacture of welded mesh supports for our larger demister pads, because the specification asked for something that welded mesh manufacturers wouldn't make, so we had to make it ourselves. By this time the factory was extremely busy, and Knitmesh was growing both in terms of turnover and profit. In the following year, 1963, the head office moved out of central London, where rents were soaring, to an office suite in Prudential House in central Croydon. As the Knitmesh side of the group grew, so did the workforce. In 1963, a young man called Philip Jones came to us as part of his HND engineering course at Wrexham Technical College, and after completing his studies he joined us on a permanent basis. For the first few months, it was the usual practice, he shadowed me, eventually releasing me from setting up work on the shop floor so that I could devote more time to customer liaison and costing. During the next 2 or 3 years we saw continuing growth, which again led to further recruitment. It was during this period actually that a certain Kate Roberts, a rather sweet young thing from Bodil Rhuddlan, with whom I shared an aunt and uncle, joined us straight from school to work as our new telephonist, receptionist and secretary. You know Kate Roberts, of course, rather more as Mrs. Reg Davis. Her elder sister, Jenny, had already been working with us for some time. In 1964, a man called Keith Ireland joined our Croydon staff, where he first worked in household articles sales. He and I were eventually to work together as the group's executive directors until my retirement in 1998. At Rhuddlan, Norman Rogers joined us after leaving Ruthin School and again spent his first few months alongside me, and he was eventually to play a major role in the computerisation of the company's costing systems, and he was to work at Greenfield as chief estimator until his departure to Pastors New a few years ago. His school friend Nick Lloyd, the son of John Lloyd, who was the land agent for Rhuddlan Estates at that time, he came to us as well and joined us a few months before our move to Greenfield in 1967. And he was to be with us as a health and safety specialist in later years before leaving sometime after my retirement. The major shareholder in Société Façonnage and Commerce was a Mr. Tavernier, a Frenchman who had a financial interest in a number of French and Canadian companies. Towards the end of 1966, he died in Canada, leaving his majority shareholding to his wife, Madame Monique Tavernier, who had been his secretary and had married the boss. All nice and convenient. She thereby became the major shareholder in the Household Articles Group. About a year previously, she'd arranged for a protege, a young man by the name of Jimmy de Vielle-Castel, and the son of a family friend, to spend some time at Rhuddlan as part of his training. He was working at the factory in Belen in France, which was still producing musical instruments and some domestic products. He would eventually succeed Tavernier as our major shareholder. He is now the chairman and owner of the group. By the latter half of 1966, we had grown to such an extent that we were literally bursting at the seams, and it became necessary for us to start looking for new premises. Now in those days, most of you were old enough to remember that there were no industrial parks, and there were no development grants, and the only suitable premises that we were able to find within 50 miles of Rhuddlan, would you believe, were large hangar-like buildings at Llanelchamore, halfway between Mostyn and Greenfield on the coast road. There was nothing else anywhere. The buildings were huge compared to the Rhuddlan factory, and we felt at the time that we'd probably have to sublet a substantial part of the site. We didn't do so, fortunately, because by 1970 all the buildings were in use. The group had now become financially strong enough for us to buy the Greenfield site outright at the outset. The move took a lot of planning, and much had to be done to the buildings before we could move in. The structure was a steel frame with corrugated iron sheets cladding it. High glass windows along the outer walls. This meant, of course, that the buildings had to be lined and insulated, and a substantial heating system would be necessary to provide the regulated temperature. They were just like great big open hangars. For about 2 months before the move, I became heavily involved in all aspects of the planning, spending quite a lot of time at Greenfield, marking out machinery position on the floor, generally overseeing the electrical, building and heating contractors, answering questions, sorting out problems, that sort of thing. And the move took place in May 1967. And it was accomplished, would you believe, without losing more than about 3 hours production. We had electricians here at Rhuddlan who were disconnecting machines. They were immediately taken out onto a low loader. When the low loader was full, the low loader went to Greenfield, where there were some more electricians ready to wire them up. And the staff had been split in two. Half of them were at Rhuddlan, half of them at Greenfield, and within virtually half an hour of some of the machines allowing at Greenfield, they were starting to run again. Our staff were transported to Greenfield daily in two 17-seat minibuses. Some people decided not to come with us. Mr. and Mrs. Walding, for example, negotiated their early retirement. At the same time as our move to Greenfield, purely by coincidence, our head office moved to about 2/3 of an office block opposite Sanderstead Station in South Croydon. We were eventually to purchase and take over the whole of this building in 1978. Some 5 months after the move, when everybody and everything had settled in and order at last prevailed, it was decided that we should have an official opening. And we arranged for an overseas agents meeting to be held at the same time. The local Conservative MP at the time was Mr. Nigel Birch, who was living in accommodation, I think, in Rhuddlan at the time. And he was asked to come and cut the tape, but he declined. Possibly because we might not have been big enough or important enough, I suppose. And possibly for the same reason, leading figures in the Labour and Liberal parties also refused. After these refusals, I offered to try and get Plaid Cymru to provide somebody. Mr. Quennan and Mr. Bailey agreed. I spoke to somebody, and to my delight, I was informed that the leader of the party and the only Plaid Cymru MP at that time, Gwynfor Evans, would be delighted to do the honours. On the left, Francis Quennan. On the right, David Price Bailey. Jenny Roberts, one of our staff, is doing the sort of Welsh lady bit, and Gwynfor Evans, of course, is quite a well-known face. And at the back, Flintshire County Councillor Mr. Esmore Thomas and his wife. A number of local dignitaries and of course local government officers came along because the drinks were free to start with. In this picture on the left you've got Mr. Richard Williams, the Flintshire Youth Employment Officer at the time. Mr. Tom Rich, Chairman of Holywell Rural Council, in the middle with his clerk, Mr. Noah Williams. The girls on the left, Frida Sharp and Elizabeth Cooper, this side, had come with us from Rhuddlan. The lady in the middle was Anwen Price. She was the first person to join us at Greenfield, and she was to become our longest serving shop floor employee at the time of her retirement in 1996. Sadly, Anwen died a couple of years ago. Our office staff decided to get in on the act as well. Any familiar faces? No? The young lady on the right is Kate Davis. Changed a bit since then, right, Richard? You can see why he married her, don't you?
Yeah. He didn't know who it was.
Thus, to all intents and purposes, our relationship with Rhuddlan came to an end. But whenever I think about this event, you know, I always recall Winston Churchill's remarks after the British victory at El Alamein, when he said, "May not be the end, it may not even be the beginning of the end, but it's certainly the end of the beginning." And that is what it proved to be. Before I finish, I'm going to give you a short little glance at the next 48 years, so you can see what happened. First of all, the board. David Price Bailey on the left, Francis Quennan on the right. David retired in 1978 and lived in the Falmouth area until his death in the 1990s. Francis Quennan was an extremely charismatic character. Every time David Bailey would announce that Francis Quennan would be coming up the next week, everybody brightened up. Everybody looked forward to him coming. Can you imagine a company where people look forward to the managing director actually coming to see them? Why? Because he talked to them at the same level. He never forgot that he'd run machines in Rhuddlan at the age of 15. He always had a very soft spot for Rhuddlan, and he often spoke of the many friends that were so kind to his family during the war. He never forgot them, and whenever he came up, he would ask me sometimes to take him to see Mrs. Knowles, who was living in Cwmrod at the time. Mrs. Knowles was part of the Knowles family, the newsagents in Bodford Street in Brill, and they had been close family friends. He was to be the group managing director until his retirement to France in 1986. Francis sadly died of cancer about 8 years ago. I'd always intended to go and see him in France, but I never got round to him. Of course, it eventually got to be too late. Jimmy de Vieille-Castel and Madame Monique Tavernier. Madame Monique Tavernier, as I've already told you, was the chief shareholder of the company, and she determined when the board meetings were to take place. She had joint citizenship. She was French and Canadian. She lived half the year in France and half the year in Canada. As the winter approached, she'd leave Canada to come back to France, but she flew into Heathrow. And when she was in London, we had a board meeting. Then she flew from London to France. 6 months later, she'd come back from France to London, we'd have a board meeting, and she would then fly out to Canada. She used to sit in on all the board meetings. She wasn't a director. She used to say quite intelligent things sometimes, but most of the time she listened very carefully. Of course, to her, it was quite an important thing because she was getting the bulk of her income from the Household Articles Group by this time. Unfortunately, she died in the early 1990s. A very sad situation. She'd come back to France and she decided to go down to the south of France on holiday. And she stayed at a hotel in Avignon. She must have eaten something that upset her, because she vomited in her sleep and ingested the vomit, and it killed her. They found her dead in the bed that morning. Jimmy Castel inherited her shareholding. She didn't have any children, so he was the sort of son that she never had, really. He remains the chairman of the group. He lived in Paris until recently. He'd married a very rich Spanish woman, so he's very comfortably off. So comfortably off these days that he's moved from Paris now and he's gone to Gstaad in Switzerland to join all the other moneyed people who live there. This is Keith Ireland. He and I were invited to join the board in 1972 when Peter Bishop, the accountant trustee, died. He worked in Croydon and was Mr. Quennon's second in command, basically. He worked in sales for a long time and worked particularly in household articles. He wasn't really a technical guy. He and I worked alongside each other as the two executive directors of the group till I retired, and he left the company about 10 years ago. He'd become managing director when Francis Quennon retired. This is me at the National Exhibition Centre with Professor Graham Davis coming in behind me. We were going into a chemical engineering exhibition, probably sometime in the late 1980s, I would guess. I'd become the group operations director on David's retirement in 1978, and I became responsible for all the factories. That meant naturally that I oversaw design and development, purchasing and supply, production, quality assurance, site services, with a senior manager in each department. I also dealt with human resources, labour relations if you like in the old language, and I had direct contact with in-house and external trade union officials. I'm glad to say that we had a very good relationship with the Transport General Workers Union. I knew the full-time officer on a first-name basis. He trusted me and I trusted him. We sat down regularly to discuss working conditions and wages, etc. And we never had the slightest bit of problem. Everything went very, very smoothly for many years. In the early 1970s, household articles had a major change in their fortunes. Up until then, they'd still been making pot scourers and kettle fur collectors and sort of just about keeping their heads above water. The French factory in Rhuddlan had been manufacturing coffee makers for some years, and they'd been selling them under their Bodum brand. In order to improve their sales in the UK, they asked household articles to stock them. doesn't seem to be a very intelligent thing really to ask a company who specialised in selling pot scourers to suddenly start selling expensive tableware like this. But they did, they asked us to do it. And of course, always ready to make money, we said, yes, okay, we're fine, we'll have a go. After a while, we were selling so many that the French were unable to produce enough. It was thus decided that we'd make them ourselves at Greenfield. The 1970s and 1980s saw an incredible growth in coffee drinking in the UK. Do you remember? Up until then, everybody only drank Nescafe. Since then, things have changed dramatically. We were hard pressed ourselves at that time to meet the demands of our customers. Customers included all the big London retailers. The John Lewis Group became our biggest customer, followed closely by Boots. We supplied Harrods, Fortnum and Mason, and also a small coffee pot chain with a few small coffee shops in central London. They were called Costa Coffee. Don't things change? Our pots were used in Buckingham Palace and by anybody who was anybody. John Major. They were sold under our La Cafetière brand name. Why Paddy Ashdown didn't buy one big one instead of two small ones, I will never understand. But there we are. In the late 1980s, because of shortage of space and the need to set up manufacturing cells for some of our customers amongst the motor manufacturers, we'd moved all coffee pot production out of Greenfield to a new site on the old Courtauld site at Greenfield, brand new factory. And for a time we also owned a plating company in Liverpool, so we were three companies in the group for a while. We eventually closed the Liverpool operation down and sourced our plating at a lower cost from a company in the Midlands. By the early 1990s, however, copies were appearing everywhere, mostly cheap Far Eastern products. The patents had expired and some of the larger stores began buying direct from China and Taiwan, selling them under their own brand names. One of the first retailers to do this was Marks & Spencer's. We found it impossible to compete against these cheap ones, primarily because these were made of plated brass. The Far Eastern stuff was all made of mild steel, which was fine as long as the plating didn't break down, because if they did, they started rusting. The quality was quite poor, but to the punter out in the street, of course, they see it looking nice and shiny. They don't look at it with the same sort of eyes as I was looking at them, and they were getting away with it. Eventually, we found it impossible to complete, and one of my last tasks before retirement entailed 3 visits to southern China to find a supplier. And after a long haul and lots of argument and discussion and saying, no, look, I don't want it as cheap as possible, I want it better than that, and I'm prepared to pay you more money. The Chinese never understood that, you know. They thought that everybody that went into China wanted stuff as cheap as possible. It didn't matter what it looked like. And it took a lot of persuading to actually get them to take more money off us, would you believe? But in the end, I found a supplier who was good enough. And production, sadly, ceased at Greenfield in 2004, and the factory on the old Courtauld estate was closed. Household Articles' name has now disappeared. The company is now known as La Cafetière. They have a large range of tableware, but it's all imported from the Far East, and only a small workforce remain, probably about 7 or 8 people, to run the stores and the dispatch functions back at the old factory at Greenfield. At Knitmesh, in the late 1980s, I began to instigate a change in company philosophy based on Japanese methods of continuous improvement. Eventually the factory was transformed, and I'm choosing my words carefully, transformed into a world-class centre of manufacturing excellence. In 1990, Keith Ireland and I were invited to visit Japan, and we spent a week at Toyota and Honda at their development centres in discussions with their engineering and production people. As a result of our visit and a subsequent very thorough 1-week quality audit by the Japanese at Greenfield, we became the sole European suppliers of knitted mesh components to Toyota, Honda, Nissan in the UK, Mitsubishi Nedcar in Holland, AC Delco, which is General Motors, in Southampton, and at their Holden plant in America. In 1997, Knitmesh won the Supplier of the Year award from Nissan, a year in which we produced not one reject of the many tens of thousands of the parts that we sent to them at Sunderland. This photograph was taken in 1992 when the company's quality systems were accredited to BS 5750 Part 2, and these people are all there as representatives of all departments at Croydon were also accredited at the same time. Eventually, however, all good things have to come to an end, and I retired in 1998. This is me with Jimmy Castell, both of us with a lot of white hair by this time. They were so glad to see me go that they decided to have a party to celebrate my going. My second in command, Dr. Martin Cooling, at the far side there, had been with me for about 10 years. He'd come to us from University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology on completion of his doctorate in chemical engineering and took over as Group Operations Director on my retirement. He was typical of our senior managers by this time. They were all highly educated, very well qualified people. The man on the right is Maldwyn Davies from Glasgow. He had joined the company at Rhuddlan a few months before I came, and he worked in the knitting shop with Bill Colley, and on Bill Colley's retirement in the 1980s, Maldwyn took charge of the knitting shop. In the late 1980s, he was instrumental in carrying out major improvements to the way we knit meshes, leading to much improved productivity within Knitmesh. He managed to find ways to speed up the machines quite drastically. We did a lot of experimental work with using different lubricants, etc. And Maldwyn was a key figure in all this. He eventually retired a few years ago. Keith Ireland left the company in 2003, and a new managing director, Lou Bingham, took over. This is now the group that Lou Bingham leads. You'll note that the HA name is now gone, and the group are known as the Greenfield Group. Knitmesh has become Knitmesh Technologies and is a company respected as the leading mesh product manufacturer in the world. Elmac is a company formed from the amalgamation of a company that they brought, a company called Elmac Limited, amalgamated with what was the welding and fabrication department during my time at Greenfield. Now there's an old saying that big trees from little acorns grow, and this group is certainly proof of that. In 1962, when I joined the firm, about 25 employees at Rhuddlan produced a group turnover of about £70,000. When I retired, I had a first-class team of 250 colleagues, and in 1998 our turnover was in excess of £12 million. Today, things are a little different. Of the 250 that they still employ, 70 of them are in a subsidiary in Port Elizabeth in South Africa, where they produce parts for the car industry there. Another 6 are in Seattle, in western United States, where we run a housing and distribution hub for Knitmesh Technologies, with a further 3 salespeople in Chicago. When I was at Greenfield 2 weeks ago, there were 2 Indians there, training prior to setting up a joint venture in India, which is going to produce parts again for the motor industry in India. The bulk of the Knitmesh Technologies work is now in the motor field. They're the leading producer of mesh parts. There are a lot of mesh parts in cars, seals, wraps and things for catalytic converters and this sort of thing. However, some things don't change. And I'm delighted to tell you that the Greenfield factory still produce thousands and thousands of scourers and kettle fur collectors. And I'm very glad of that, I'm very proud, you know, that they're still doing that. Wasn't it some tree that was planted all those years back ago, years back in Rhuddlan, eh? And to think that it all came about because of a little neurotic Austrian house painter with big ideas and a funny moustache. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask, or any memories that you'd like to share with us? Any questions? Just like to know something. I want to know when they first started making those. how did they just knit them like a knitting?
I've got bits and pieces here that you're very welcome to come and look at actually. This is Knitmesh, okay? As I said, it's knit in a big cylinder, in a big tube basically, like that. This I think is some sort of stainless steel. These days, I think at Knitmesh, they knit virtually any sort of metal you can get. On top of that, they also knit things like glass fibre, lots of plastics including Teflon. Metals ranging from nice, soft, easy things to knit like copper, silver-plated copper, etc., right through to very high tensile, high temperature stainless steels. And believe you me, they're a world apart when it comes to knitting. It's not like cotton, you know, with cotton you can do anything, it's easy, it doesn't wear out the machines. Some wire, titanium particularly, is notorious for not having a very smooth surface. If you look at it under a microscope, it's like sandpaper, and it chews up knitting machines. You know, all the heads where they pull the wire and they get slotted, and they eventually have to be all machined off and polished up again. As I said, they now knit meshes which are up to 1 metre in diameter. They're doing an awful lot of development work these days. Much of the stuff they're doing goes into quite complex situations, I think. I was there 2 weeks ago talking to 2 of the senior managers who were working on a knitting machine. Knitting machine was knitting a sleeve of metal over a graphite core. They've been working on the development of this thing for 2 years, would you believe? They have to get it exactly right. They've had problems getting the material to start with because the specification of the metal is key, because the item is going to end its life, or spend all its life, somewhere inside a nuclear reactor, where nobody will be able to get at it once it's got in. So it's got to be right, and it's got to work for the whole life of the reactor. We were doing that many years ago. When I was at Rhuddlan, I remember working on some metal seals which were going to be used as standpipe gaskets at Wilbur. We made hundreds and hundreds of them, and they've been in Wilbur, inaccessible somewhere within the reactor, ever since Wilbur opened. As far as I'm aware, they've had no trouble with them at all. But the specifications for these things are extremely keen. Pot scours, of course, are extremely easy things to make. Basically, what you've got is a piece of mesh which is about, say, about 4 inches wide, and basically what you do, you take a sock and you roll it up. You roll it up, and then you put a piece of wire through and you sew it. Easy. Dead easy to make. That's a galvanised steel one. These have actually come out of the Knitmesh factory a fortnight ago. They sell thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. In this day and age where there's so many different things that you can clean a saucepan with, these things still sell, particularly to the catering trade, surprisingly. Some catering people take stainless steel ones. That's a mixture of copper and galvanised steel. That's galvanised steel. This is polypropylene, and I think I've probably got a copper one in here as well. Oh yeah, that's a copper one. What else have I got? I've got lots of little different types of meshes for you to look at. Again, these have all come from Greenfield this week. Small compressed products. This is a seal for a catalytic converter. I don't know whether any of you know anything about catalytic converters. The catalyst, of course, is normally... What is a catalyst?
Platinum.
Platinum, yes, normally. Very expensive, of course. It's so thin that you can't really see it. The catalytic converter that you buy, it looks like an exhaust box, basically. It's exactly the same shape as an exhaust box. It's made in 2 halves. Inside it, there's normally either 1 or 2 blocks. Oval in shape, about that long normally. There we are, that shape, and about that long. And they're a honeycomb. Little holes through the thing. And all the insides are coated in platinum. I remember going to Calsonic in Sunderland. Calsonic make Nissan's exhaust systems. And they were telling me that for some months they'd been dealing with these. They'd only just started making catalytic converters. And for months they'd been sort of brushing dust off the desk every night after finishing work. Until somebody said, hang on a minute, don't do that. And came back the following day with a special little vacuum cleaner, because what they were brushing away, throwing away, was pure platinum. People do silly things still. But there we are, that's a typical little seal. And that's what I got. Don't know what it is, but it works. It's probably some sort of gasket of some sort. This is a filter, basically. Some of these filters, of course, work just like sieves, because that's all they are, really. Solid stainless. Most of these things are in stainless steel. Another scourer. This, I think, from the density, is a seal which goes into an exhaust system, which allows the exhaust system to move.
Flux.
It's pretty solid, actually. Anyway, I'll leave them here for you to have a look at.
Try that.
I thought as much.
It was interesting to hear your comments about the lead time, shall we say, in the early days in Rhuddlan, when sales were perhaps as well as they could be. In those days, I was a bank cashier in the little sub-branch,
Yeah.
and I used to do the daily wages, and it might be a source of comfort to know that your credit open was never ever queried. We never had a phone call from Barclays saying, don't do it this week. So his reputation was sound internally anyway.
By the time I joined the company, I think the financial situation was much improved, you know. We built a good reputation up with the suppliers because we always paid on time. We never had in my time any problem getting a supplier to give us the best possible service next day, or you know, they'd break their necks because they knew if they presented us with a bill, they were always paid on time. Sometimes we paid within a week if it was necessary. Oddly enough, we operated like that, although we were operating in an environment which wasn't like that at all, because it was the biggest and probably the richest companies in the country that were the worst payers. Marconi comes to mind.
GEC.
They were terrible. Yes. GEC, Marconi, Cossa, they were all working at that time on contracts for Royal Navy, Ministry of Defence, that sort of thing. Sometimes they'd come on the phone and they'd say, got a problem. Oh. Can you send us 12 of these tonight in the post? And I'd say, yes, if you go and talk to your accounts department first. You give us a cheque, we'll give you the things. But you haven't paid us for 3 months. And that happened. And it worked, you know, it worked a bomb. Because quite often, of course, the purchasing department didn't know that the accounts department weren't settling the bills. Big companies were notorious at that time. It's a shame, really. I think, you know, a lot of companies, small companies, struggle because people don't pay them on time. I sometimes feel, you know, that the government should bring in a law saying that everybody who buys anything should pay 30 days. If everybody did that, the money would go around, everybody would have their money, and nobody would be in financial problems.
And as you said before, the banks are quite happy to lend you money if you don't want it.
Yes.
But.
Yes, exactly.
And it hasn't altered. In fact, it's got worse, probably.
Tell me about it. About 2 years ago, or less than 2 years ago, I moved from Dysart to Rhuddlan. I lived in a big house in Rhuddlan and bought a small house in, a big house in Dysart, small house in Rhuddlan. And there was going to be a difference of something like £300,000 in the cost. I'd already got a purchaser. Could I get the bank to give me a mortgage? Oh, you're 74, 73 at the time. Can't have a mortgage. I said I only want it for 2 months. unless you give me a bridging loan, or we don't have bridging loans anymore, we don't do things like that. And they refused me.
So you changed banks then, presumably?
Rather stupidly, no, I didn't.
That's again the same old story. Yeah.
Yes, we can't be bothered, do we? So
No.
let's do the same.
I know, done it myself.
There we are.
I've heard comment from people that you were a very, very good employer for your workforce. I remember hearing it was in the 60s when the hovercraft was in Rhyl that you actually took
We took
employees
everybody,
on a trip on
Yes.
it. Can you explain that?
Yeah, we did. Well, you know, as I was saying earlier, one of the fields that we're working on was liquid vapor separation systems. Basically, what we're talking about is in chemical engineering, quite often, I'll try and explain it in simple layman's terms. You get a chemical reaction going on in a vessel, and that produces a gas, and the gas is drawn off into another vessel. But when the gas comes off the surface of the liquid, it takes liquid with it. And quite often, you don't want the liquid in the next pad. So these days, the ways of getting rid of it is to put a knitted mesh pad, something like 4 to 6 inches thick, like a big blanket, if you like, across. I have a picture of one of them, if you know, the one in 3 sections. You put that across the thing, so if you've designed it properly, taking into account things like vapor density at operating temperatures and pressures and all this sort of thing, there are formula for working out the correct thickness and the correct size. Sometimes the vessel has to be sized so the velocity is correct. If it works at the right speed, the droplets going through the mesh hit the wires and stick to them, and then they fall back, and the vapor going through is then dry, as it were. The same thing happened in hovercraft, because hovercraft, of course, use jet engines, and jet engines use an awful lot of air. They were sucking in air, but of course they were sucking an awful lot of seawater in as well. So we, together with Saunders Rowe at the time, designed pads made out of polypropylene. Polypropylene for lightness and for corrosion resistance in seawater. They were excellent, really. And the air was drawn in through these pads, and the pads took out all the spray, basically. And when the hovercraft came to Rhyl, we decided to take everybody on the hovercraft for a ride, because it was something, of course, that they all knew about. They all knew that they were using some of our pads. So we went. I remember on the way back they lost the cushion, and we had an awfully uncomfortable voyage back from Wallasey. We just bounced away because we weren't hovering really. But yeah, I think we were very lucky. Francis Quennan and David Price Bailey, and I like to think I as well, we were those sort of people, you know. We liked the people we worked with, and hopefully they liked us as well. In Greenfield, as I said, when I started changing the company's philosophy and going towards the thing the Japanese did, I instituted a work uniform. We all wore exactly the same workwear, right from me down to the chap who brushed the factory. And we all had our names on the name badge. And we only had our first names on them. I was known to everybody throughout the factory as Dick. If anybody called me the boss, they were put up against the wall and threatened. I hated the term boss and everything that it implies. It wasn't my way of managing, you know. That way, you get a good relationship with people, and it brings out the best in all of us. And it works. It pays hands down. They enjoyed their work, and I enjoyed working with them.
Well, we've certainly enjoyed listening to you. Thank you very much. I'd
Yeah.
like Naomi, she's a biscuit, say an official thank you.
On behalf of the group, I'd like to say, I can't quite believe it actually, what you've been talking about. It's just been amazing. The way it started and the way it expanded, and the things that you've done and what you've made and the people that you've worked with and everything. It sounds absolutely fantastic. I do remember Knitmesh when I first came to live here, but you'd gone, I think, before that. And then things go around. My son lives in Sanderstead.
Oh,
Yes, I'm going, Sanderstead? I can understand why they went there.
Yeah.
You know, but it's been fantastic, all the things that you've been talking about and how you've done things, and I just thought they made scouts, you know, and I'm really ashamed of myself, you know, that I didn't realise what had gone on, and
Well, yeah.
you know, and everything, and it's been absolutely super. Thanks ever so much. We're really grateful. We really are. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Tea would be nice.
Two.
I think the thing was, if I may say, is that the way that you presented it, you know, from the start to the finish, it was in easy language, explained, you did it visually, and you know, you got your message across, and I thought it was fantastic. I've been to quite a few lectures of one thing and kind of another, and I think that must be one of the best I've ever been to. I'd like to
Well,
say
you know,
that.
when you've been sort of running a group of companies for about 20 years, you get better at it in any world. Because if you don't talk to your workforce, you get nowhere, you know.
No.
I had to spend an awful lot of time
Yeah.
talking to them. I was one of these guys that always, well, I claimed that I managed by walkabout.
Yes.
You don't manage a factory sitting on your backside in an office.
No.
Every morning when I went in, the first thing I did was walk around the whole place.
Yeah.
I spoke to everybody, you know.
And I think that's how you've been able to get it across tonight. Because when you said, you know, how your grassroots, they never forgot it. And that's the important thing. Because a lot of people, when they get to talk, and they think because they're the boss, they're sort of telling you something, but they're telling you downwards, not on the level plane. That's what I found very interesting, the way you put it across.
Well, you know, communication is important. If you want to get the best out of your workforce, they need to know what's going on, you know. This is something that was part of this sort of continuous improvement program and total quality management that we brought into the company in the 1980s. We would tell the people how the company was doing on a weekly basis, you know. We'd literally publish account details, and we put them up on the wall in the canteen, and we'd say, if you don't understand it, come and talk to us. It was an interesting time, you know. I remember going to, it was basically about getting people to try and think about the way they worked. I was saying earlier that in Rhuddlan we'd bought old ex-army tables. They were 6 foot long, 2 foot 6 wide, and 2 women would work at each set of 2 tables. They'd lay out the work, and they'd be working on these 2 tables. They always worked in pairs. And then, in Greenfield, sometime, it must have been in the late 70s, no, it must have been the early 80s, I suppose, I read an article about Volvo in Sweden, about an experiment they just started carrying out in Sweden, making cars. What they'd done, instead of getting this guy putting on the same 2 wheels on the same side of every car that went past him, they decided to split the workforce up into teams of people. And after 2 hours they changed, and instead of putting the 2 wheels on, they'd put the radiator in, or they'd go and do something else. So that at the end of the day, about 10 people would be able to say, we made that car. And I started sitting in my office, I started thinking about this. And I went out under the shop floor, and I said to the supervisor in the Mr. section, which were making these big pads, I said, I want you to get all your girls together, get them to stop working. I want to get them all together around this table, sit them down in chairs, I want to talk to them. Of course, you know, as soon as you do that, they sort of start thinking, exactly, you know, what have we done wrong? And the first thing you have to say, look,
Done nothing wrong.
don't worry about it, this is nothing wrong, this might turn out to be quite nice. I want to ask you some questions, because I want you to help me. Question number 1. Why do you work in pairs? Why 2 there, 2 there, 2 there? So I sort of looked at each other, and then looked at me, and they said, well, we've always worked in pairs. So I said, yes, I know, but why? You know? Don't know. So I said, right, I want you to help me to carry out an experiment. Your supervisor will, this week, provide all the patterns and all the meshes for half of you for next week. Next Monday when you come in, you'll have enough work set out, patterns drawn, instructions laid out, meshes already on pallets, to keep you working until Friday night. Half of you will use that. The other half will carry on doing as they are now, working in pairs. When you lot, I'll call you Team 1, when Team 1 comes in on Monday morning, I want you to have a look at all the work that you do and you decide how you tackle it. The only rule that you have to follow is that they've all got to be out of the door by Friday night. Monday morning I came in, and of course I went straight into the shop floor. I didn't go right up to them, I stood back because I didn't want to get in the way. And they were all in a huddle, looking through all these papers. On Thursday, 4 o'clock, they were saying, please can we have more work, please we're finished. They'd taken 80% of the time to do what they normally took 100% to do. I said, what happened? What did you do on Monday morning? They said, well, we went through all these jobs and then we realised that there was this job where we had to make 100 of these and it's an awfully boring job. So we all decided to all do them to get it out of the way. And that's how we went, you know. And they started saying, well, she's pretty good at hooking, she's a better one at cutting and this sort of like. And they started seeing and looking at analysing the skills that they had in the team. Never looked back. They've never worked in pairs since. Of course, the following week, the other girls were looking and saying, what's going on then? And I'd say, come on, you want to get, you know, do you want to do the same? Oh yeah. And that's what happened. We started telling them about how things went. But we started having problems as supervisors. Because all these girls were suddenly making their own decisions about how they made things. And the supervisors feeling, well, you know, what am I here for, you know? And particularly when we started giving them information, you know. They know as much as I do, you know, why are you telling them? So I said, well, hang on a minute, what have you lost? What do you mean? Well, I think in terms of the information I'm giving you to you as a bucketful. You've got a bucket under your arm, I give you all this information, beginning of the week, now then, go and give that information out to everybody. And when you've done so, have another look in your bucket and tell me if it's got any less in it than it had before. You can't give information away, you can only share it. So you're not losing anything, everybody else is gaining. And they had to learn the hard way, you know. Would you believe that 2 supervisors left because they couldn't cope with it? We started looking at statistical process control. Any of you know anything about statistical process control? You know about SPC? If you like, it's a statistical mathematical method of controlling production. Let's take this thing as an example. This thing, you knit the mesh, you roll it up in a particular way, you put it in a particular tool, and the press comes down and squeezes it. So they're all exactly the same, aren't they? No, they're not. No, they're not. The piece of wire in that may not have exactly the same temper as the piece of wire in the next bit. The compressor driving the press might have a little variation in its performance, so it's not pushing down exactly the same speed all the time. So what you have to do is you carry out a capability study. You make a lot of them and you measure them, all of them. And then you churn all this material, all this information, into a scientific calculator. And you work out the averages in terms of diameter, for example. And Gaussian statistics will tell you what the capability of that product is. Whether it can produce this thing without fault inside the tolerance range that you give it. And you can use that to control the process. And we started talking to the supervisors about this. What? They've got to put this information into a scientific calculator? They can't do that. Why not? They're not numerate, aren't they? Have you seen them checking their pay packet at the end of the week? Have you seen them playing darts? Now tell me they're not numerate. And we had girls who came straight from school at 15, 16, no training whatsoever, except what we trained them to do, who were doing this sort of thing. And at Greenfield today, everything virtually of this sort of nature that's made is controlled by statistical process, where the girls will make so many, and they take one out every now and again, and they measure it. And they plot it on a graph. And if it starts going outside the tolerance, you'll see this sort of size, let's say it's the diameter, you'll see it suddenly start creeping up in the graph. But they find it creeping up long before they get to the stage where it's going to be too big. So they then stop the process. And they take a few samples and they measure it again. Because sometimes, of course, it might start to go up, but then it might go back down again. And by checking regularly, they can find out whether the process is going out of control. If it is, they can then adjust the process to bring it back. And that's the way that Knitmesh Limited sold 50,000 of those things to Nissan in 1 year without one reject whatsoever. But it's done by people with no special education, you know. All it needs is care, training, and a little bit of kindness when you handle them as well, because a lot of people are afraid of doing this sort of thing. And you've got to show them how. But it works.
Yeah, good work, right.
Thanks very much indeed. We've got to do a raffle now, I think. Yes?
Sorry.